Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening up a document that, it essentially governs the entire landscape of global commerce.
It really does.
Yeah, yet it's something that most people outside of the compliance and certification industry have never actually read.
Right. They wouldn't have a reason to.
Exactly. So today, we are going to be acting as your guides. Think of us as a pair of instructors walking you step by step through the exact original sequence of ISO IEC 70-1-1 2015.
Yeah, that is a mouthful of a title, but it is the definitive rulebook for the rulemakers. I mean, anyone listening to this who works in quality management or environmental health and safety or information security, you're intimately familiar with standard certifications like ISO 9001 or 2701.
Right. You build your management systems to meet those requirements.
Exactly. But this deep dive isn't about those standards. This is about the meta layer. When a certification body sends an auditor to your facility to determine if you actually get that piece of paper, that certification body is legally and contractually bound to follow the 17021-1 standard.
We are looking at the architecture of trust here because let's say I'm a major automotive manufacturer, right? And I am requiring all 3,000 of my suppliers to hold an ISO 9001 certification. I am essentially outsourcing my trust to those certification bodies.
Yes, you have to.
I need to know that a certificate issued in Germany carries the exact same weight, the exact same rigor, and absolute objectivity as a certificate issued in Brazil or Japan.
Right. How do you ensure the certifiers aren't just, selling gold stars to the highest bidder?
That is the mission of this document. We're going to walk through the clauses, uncovering the rules, the structural firewalls, and honestly, the deeply psychological parameters that keep the certification industry honest.
And we're going to start right at the beginning with Section 1, which covers clauses 1 through 3. So that's scope and definitions, setting the ground rules.
The scope is straightforward, but vast.
It is. This standard applies to anybody providing audit and certification of management systems. It doesn't matter if it's an environmental management system, an IT service management system, or a food safety management system.
Right. If it's a third-party conformity assessment, 17021 is the governing law.
It sets a baseline. But the definitions in Clause 3, that's where the actual boundaries of the industry are drawn. I mean, we all know what an audit is. We all know what a client is. But the standard takes very specific common words and locks them into legal definitions that have massive ramifications for how a certification body operates.
Let's look at the concept of impartiality.
Yeah, so the standard defines impartiality simply as the presence of objectivity, but the subsequent notes in the text expand on this significantly. Objectivity means that conflicts of interest do not exist, or, well, if they do, they are resolved so as not to adversely influence the subsequent activities of the certification body.
It requires independence, freedom from bias, neutrality.
Fairness, open-mindedness, even-handedness, and detachment.
That string of words, especially detachment and even-handedness, it really forces the certification body to act almost as a judicial entity.
It really does.
And that leads to one of the most contentious boundaries in the entire industry, which is the definition of management system consultancy.
Yes, Clause 3.3. This is where the standard drops a massive concrete wall between two highly lucrative business models. Consultancy is defined as participation in establishing, implementing, or maintaining a management system.
So the moment an individual or an organization starts writing manuals for a client, or designing your specific processes or acting as their internal auditor, they are engaged in consultancy.
Precisely. But the gray areas here are notorious in the field. Let's say an auditor is on site, and the client is genuinely struggling to understand a specific requirement of ISO 14001 regarding environmental aspects. The auditor explains the theory behind the requirement.
Does that cross the line into consultancy?
Well, the standard provides crucial nuance there. It explicitly states that arranging training and participating as a trainer is not considered consultancy, provided that the training relates to generic management systems or auditing.
Okay, so an auditor or a certification body can explain the standard. They could explain theories. They can even share publicly available best practices.
Right.
But the line is crossed when the information shifts from generic to client-specific.
Exactly. So if I am the auditor, I can say something like, the standard requires you to have a method for evaluating the effectiveness of your corrective actions. A common theoretical approach in the industry is using a 30, 60, 90-day review cycle.
That is generic.
Yes. But the moment I say you need to update your specific corrective action procedure, document number 402, to include a 30-day review signed off by your quality manager,
You have just become a consultant.
I have. That is the exact friction point. Providing a tailored solution to a specific client issue is consultancy. And the reason this boundary is policed so aggressively in 17021-1 is because of the self-review threat, which we will analyze deeply when we get to Clause 4.
But before we leave the definitions, we need to discuss how the standard grades failures, the distinction between major and minor nonconformities.
Right. For anyone who has ever sat through a closing meeting, these terms carry a lot of weight.
A ton of weight.
Yeah.
But the standard doesn't just leave it up to the auditor's feelings, right? It actually defines the thresholds.
It does. So a nonconformity is simply the non-fulfillment of a requirement. But a major nonconformity is defined as a failure that affects the capability of the management system to achieve its intended results.
The text highlights specific conditions for this, doesn't it?
Yeah, if there is a significant doubt that effective process control is in place or that products or services will meet specified requirements, it is a major.
Let's put some industry context around that. A minor nonconformity is typically a localized breakdown. Imagine a manufacturing facility where a specific supervisor missed a signature on a daily calibration log for a torque wrench.
Right, the process exists, the wrench is actually calibrated, but the administrative execution failed in one instance.
Exactly. It doesn't threaten the entire production line.
But a major nonconformity means the system itself is fundamentally broken, missing, or utterly ignored. If the auditor discovers that the facility has completely stopped calibrating their torque wrenches for the last 6 months, and there is no tracking mechanism in place at all.
That introduces massive doubt that the final product meets safety specifications.
Exactly. That affects the capability of the whole system.
And the standard includes a very interesting caveat regarding minor nonconformities compounding into a major one.
It does. A number of minor nonconformities associated with the same requirement or issue could demonstrate a systemic failure and thus constitute a major nonconformity.
So if one supervisor misses a signature, it's a minor. But if the auditor samples 10 different departments and finds that none of the supervisors are signing their calibration logs, the isolated incidents have established a pattern.
Yeah, the training system or the management oversight system has failed systemically. That elevates it to a major.
The final foundational definition we really need to look at is the logistics of time. The standard draws a hard line between audit time and audit duration.
Which on the surface sounds like bureaucratic semantics.
Right, why does the standard care about the difference between time and duration?
Because of the commercial realities of the certification business, certification bodies are essentially selling time and expertise. Duration is strictly defined as the time from the opening meeting to the closing meeting. It is the actual boots-on-the-ground, face-to-face evaluation time.
So if the auditor arrives at 8 a.m. on Tuesday and conducts the closing meeting at 4 p.m. on Thursday, the duration is roughly 24 working hours.
Correct. But audit time encompasses the entire life cycle necessary to execute an effective audit. It includes the duration, but it adds the critical off-site activities.
Like the time spent analyzing the client's application.
Yes, planning the audit schedule, reviewing their top-level documentation before arriving on site, and crucially, the time required to write the comprehensive audit report and review corrective actions afterward.
This distinction prevents a very specific type of corner cutting, doesn't it? If a standard says a specific facility requires, say, 5 days of audit time, a certification body might try to win the contract by telling the client, we'll only be on site for 2 days, saving you disruption.
Right, and they claim the other 3 days are planning and reporting.
Exactly. By defining both terms separately, 17021-1 forces certification bodies to justify their calculations and ensures the actual on-site duration isn't cannibalized by administrative overhead, just to offer a cheaper, faster, and ultimately less rigorous audit.
And that structural rigor transitions us perfectly into Section 2 of our walkthrough, which covers Clause 4, principles. If Clauses 1 through 3 are the vocabulary, Clause 4 is the philosophy driving the entire document.
The standard notes that these principles are not auditable requirements in their own right, correct?
That's right. You can't write a nonconformity against a principle, but they are the underlying foundation for the specific rules that follow. We can think of them as the 7 pillars of trust.
And the first pillar, unsurprisingly, is impartiality. But what makes Clause 4 so compelling is that it doesn't just mandate impartiality. It essentially provides a psychological profile of the threats that undermine it.
It forces the certification body to look at the human element of auditing. It reads almost like an analysis of human frailty in a commercial setting.
The text identifies several specific threats to impartiality. The most obvious is the self-interest threat,
Yeah, the standard explicitly points out financial self-interest.
which addresses the fundamental paradox of the entire third-party certification industry. The entity being evaluated is paying the evaluator. The certification body's revenue, the auditor's salary, the hotel they stay in is all funded by the client they are meant to objectively judge.
The commercial pressure is immense. If a certification body becomes known for being excessively strict, failing clients in the spending certificates, word gets around. Clients might start looking for a more, let's say, pragmatic certification body.
The self-interest threat is the constant underlying gravity pulling against objective auditing.
Right, and the standard forces certification bodies to acknowledge this reality rather than pretend it doesn't exist.
Then we have the self-review threat. The standard describes this as a person or body reviewing work done by themselves. This ties directly back to our discussion on consultancy.
If we look at historical parallels in the broader financial auditing world, like the collapse of Enron and Archer Andersen, we see the catastrophic results of the self-review threat.
Yeah, when the consulting arm of a business builds a complex, potentially flawed system, and then the auditing arm of that same business is sent in to verify it.
Human nature and corporate alignment make it nearly impossible for the auditor to aggressively tear down their own company's work.
You are inherently blind to the flaws in a system you helped create. You understand the intent behind a confusing procedure because you wrote it, so you don't flag it as a nonconformity, even though a completely independent auditor would look at it and say, this makes no sense.
Exactly. The third threat the standard identifies is the familiarity threat, also referred to as the trust threat. This occurs when a person or body becomes too familiar with or trusting of the client instead of seeking objective audit evidence.
This is a huge issue for veteran auditors. Imagine you have an auditor who has been visiting the same chemical manufacturing plant in Germany for 6 consecutive years.
They know the management team.
Right. They go out to dinner with the quality director, they ask about each other's families. Over time, that professional skepticism naturally erodes.
It replaces objective verification with interpersonal trust. The auditor might be looking at a complex maintenance schedule for a hazardous materials holding tank. Because they trust the maintenance manager, who they have known for half a decade, they might just ask, are you guys still keeping up with the weekly pressure tests on tank 4?
And the manager says, absolutely, you know we never miss those.
And the auditor ticks the box.
Without actually demanding to see the physical records, the signatures, and the pressure output logs. The familiarity threat destroys the core mechanism of an audit, which is evidence-based verification.
And it's incredibly insidious because it doesn't feel malicious. It just feels like a good working relationship.
Conversely, the fourth threat is entirely overt, the intimidation threat. The standard defines this as a perception of being coerced, openly or secretively. It gives the example of a threat to be replaced or reported to a supervisor.
This requires us to look at the power dynamics during an audit. You might have a single auditor standing in the boardroom of a massive multinational corporation. That client might hold a multi-million-dollar global certification contract with the cert body.
If the auditor finds a critical failure that threatens to suspend the certificate, which could halt the client's ability to ship products to their customers, the intimidation can be palpable.
Oh, absolutely. The client's executive team might imply or outright state, if you write this up as a major nonconformity, we are going to escalate this to your global director. We will dispute your findings, and we will pull our contract from your certification body next year.
The pressure on the individual auditor to soften the blow, to downgrade that major to a minor just to avoid the conflict is the intimidation threat in action.
It requires immense fortitude to withstand that, which we will explore when we get to the auditor behavioral profiles in NXD. But moving on to the next pillars, competence and responsibility.
Competence is obvious. You need personnel who actually know what they are doing. But the responsibility pillar is a crucial legal and operational boundary.
Clause 4.3 makes it unequivocally clear. The client organization, not the certification body, is responsible for consistently achieving the intended results of implementation of the management system. The certification body's responsibility is solely to assess sufficient objective evidence upon which to base a certification decision.
This is about shifting liability. A certification body is not a guarantor. If a food packaging company is ISO 22000 certified, and 6 months after the audit they have a massive contamination outbreak, the certification body is not legally culpable for the outbreak.
No, they are a referee calling the game based on the evidence presented during the specific time frame of the audit. They are verifying that a system exists and was functioning at that moment. They cannot guarantee that human error or malfeasance won't bypass the system the next day.
The next two pillars, openness and confidentiality, represent a delicate balancing act. Clauses 4.4 and 4.5. On one hand, the certification body must provide public access to information about the audit process and the certification status of any client.
The entire value of an ISA certificate relies on the public or the supply chain being able to verify it.
Right. If an aerospace contractor claims they are AS9100 certified, the Department of Defense needs to be able to call the certification body and get a clear yes or no on whether that certificate is currently valid, suspended, or withdrawn. That is the openness.
But that openness cannot extend to the operational details discovered during the audit. To conduct an effective audit, the auditor needs unrestricted access to the client's most sensitive proprietary secrets.
Trade secrets, financial structures, security vulnerabilities, unreleased product designs.
Exactly. If the certification body does not guarantee absolute confidentiality, the client will restrict access, they will hide information, and the audit becomes a superficial exercise. The standard demands transparency regarding the status of the certificate, but absolute lockdown on the contents of the audit.
Rounding out the principles, we have responsiveness to complaints and a risk-based approach. The complaints mechanism ensures that if someone outside the process, a consumer, a regulatory body, or an employee flags an issue with a certified client, the cert body must investigate. It prevents the system from becoming an echo chamber.
And the risk-based approach requires the certification body to evaluate the risks associated with providing certification. This isn't just about the risk of making the wrong certification decision. It involves evaluating the operational risks.
Are we sending auditors into a politically unstable region?
Are they auditing a high-hazard chemical facility where physical safety is a concern? The entire architecture of the certification body must be built to manage and mitigate risk.
Which perfectly transitions us into Section 3 of our journey. Laying down the law. Clauses 5 and 6 detail the general and structural requirements. We move from the philosophical principles to the structural armor required to enforce them.
Clause 5.1 starts with legal and contractual matters. The cert body must be a legal entity, and it must retain absolute authority over its certification decisions.
This means a certification body cannot delegate the final decision-making power to a franchisee or a subcontractor. The legal entity whose name is on the certificate holds the ultimate legal accountability.
But the real meat of this section is Clause 5.2, management of impartiality. We discussed the self-review threat regarding consultancy. Here is where the standard deploys its primary weapon against it.
The two-year rule.
Clause 5.2.6. It is one of the most famous and strictly enforced rules in the industry. It explicitly states that a certification body, or any part of its same legal entity, cannot provide internal audits to its certified clients.
Furthermore, if they provided management system consultancy, they cannot certify that system for a minimum of 2 years following the end of the consultancy.
Let's explore the operational reality of this. A massive consulting firm helps a global logistics company completely overhaul their information security management system over the course of 18 months. They write the policies, they configure the risk assessment models.
The project finishes.
The logistics company now needs an ISO 27001 certification. They loved working with the consulting firm, and they know that firm has a separate division that acts as an accredited certification body. They want to hire them for the audit.
The standard unequivocally forbids it. The consulting arm and the auditing arm exist under the same legal entity or are linked by common ownership. The self-review threat is too high.
The logistics company must go find a completely separate, independent certification body. And they cannot use the auditing arm of their consulting firm for at least 24 months.
Why specifically 2 years?
It is an internationally recognized cooling-off period. 2 years is considered sufficient time for the management system to evolve away from its initial creation. Personnel will have turned over, the system will have undergone its own internal audits and management reviews, and the immediate psychological attachment of a consulting firm to their creation has faded.
The system now truly belongs to the client, allowing for objective evaluation.
Exactly. The standard also aggressively targets the marketing relationships between consultancies and certification bodies. Clause 5.2.9 states, a cert body's activities cannot be marketed or linked with a consultancy organization.
It prohibits the wink and nod arrangements.
Right. A consulting firm cannot go to a prospective client and say, hire us to build your system, and because we have a great relationship with XYZ certification body, we can guarantee your audit will be simpler, faster, and less expensive.
There are no fast passes. The standard demands that the cert body must actually take action to correct any inappropriate claims made by a consultancy organization.
If a cert body finds out a consultant is using their logo on a brochure, implying a guaranteed pass, the cert body is legally obligated by 17021 Day 1 to send a cease and desist and separate themselves from those claims.
To ensure all of this impartiality management is actually functioning, Clause 5.2.3 introduces a fascinating structural requirement. The certification body must establish a committee to safeguard impartiality.
But the composition of this committee is heavily regulated.
The committee watchdogs. The standard says the cert body must identify and invite appropriate interested parties to advise on matters affecting impartiality, and this consultation must be balanced, with no single interest predominating.
How do you actually build that in the real world? A certification body cannot just stack this committee with its own executives or shareholders because their interest is commercial growth, not impartiality. They have to go out into the industry and recruit a balanced mix.
They need representatives from their certified clients. They need people from industry trade associations. They need members of governmental regulatory bodies or NGOs or consumer advocacy groups.
It's a built-in system of checks and balances. If the CEO of the certification body starts implementing a policy to reduce audit times across the board by 20% to undercut competitors and increase market share, this committee is designed to review that policy.
The regulatory representatives and the NGOs will look at that and say, this compromises the rigor of the audit. You are sacrificing impartiality for profit. We object.
And the cert body must document how they address these objections. Clauses 5.3 and 6 wrap up the structural requirements by mandating that the cert body evaluate its finances to ensure commercial pressures don't compromise impartiality. It requires clear identification of top management.
And importantly, it demands strict operational control over any branch offices or agents. If a certification body based in London opens a branch office in Mumbai, the London headquarters must have total control over the competence and procedures of the Mumbai office.
They cannot operate as a rogue franchise handing out substandard certificates because the name on the certificate carries the global weight of the brand.
Which brings us to the operational core of the certification body, the people actually doing the work. Section 4 covers Clause 7, resource requirements. And to truly understand this clause, we have to pull in the normative annexes at the back of the document. Annexes A through D.
These annexes essentially define the DNA of an auditor.
Clause 7.1 dictates that the cert body must have processes to determine the competence criteria for personnel involved in the audit. Annex A provides an exhaustive matrix of the required knowledge and skills. It is not enough to just be good at reading an ISO standard.
Far from it. The matrix requires auditors to have knowledge of business management practices, audit principles, and specific management system standards. But critically, they require deep knowledge of the client's business sector.
You cannot send an auditor whose entire career has been spent auditing software development firms into a heavy metallurgical foundry.
No, they won't understand the regulatory context, the specific environmental risks, or the operational flow. They won't know what a critical control point looks like in a blast furnace operation.
Furthermore, the annex mandates language and communication skills appropriate to all levels of a client organization. An auditor's environment changes drastically throughout a single day. At 9 a.m., they are in the C-suite, interviewing the CEO about strategic direction, corporate governance, and risk appetite.
They must speak the language of executive management.
And at 1 p.m., that same auditor is out on the noisy shop floor, wearing steel-toed boots and ear protection, interviewing a forklift operator about their daily safety checklist.
They have to be able to drop the corporate jargon and communicate clearly, respectfully, and effectively with frontline workers. If they only know how to talk to executives, they will never uncover the operational realities of the system.
So how does a certification body ensure their auditors possess this massive array of skills? Clause 7.1.3 and Annexes B and C outline the evaluation processes. It goes far beyond simply reviewing a resume.
They have to evaluate them through a combination of methods: reviewing records of previous audits, gathering feedback from past employers and clients. But they also have to conduct interviews, use written and oral exams, and crucially, observe them conducting a live audit.
A senior auditor will shadow a trainee to witness how they handle conflict, how they follow audit trails, and how they manage their time.
But the most profound section regarding personnel is Annex D. It moves completely away from technical knowledge and delves into the desired personal behaviors of an auditor.
It is essentially a psychological profile. The standard lists traits like being tenacious, perceptive, diplomatic, collaborative, and open-minded.
Tenacious means they are persistent and focused on achieving objectives. If a client is giving evasive answers or trying to steer the auditor away from a specific department, a tenacious auditor doesn't just give up and move on. They politely but firmly insist on following the trail.
Perceptive means they are instinctively aware of situations. They notice the body language of the warehouse manager who is sweating while answering questions about hazardous waste disposal.
But the standout trait, the one that truly defines the profession and is explicitly listed in Annex D, is being morally courageous.
The standard defines this as being willing to act responsibly and ethically, even though these actions may not always be popular and may sometimes result in disagreement or confrontation.
This is where the theory of auditing meets the brutal reality of corporate pressure. Let's role-play how this actually manifests.
Okay.
An auditor has been on site at a major manufacturing facility for 4 days. The audit team is exhausted. The client has been incredibly hospitable, providing lunches, giving great presentations. The client's executive team is highly anxious because they are bidding on a massive government contract, and winning that contract is entirely contingent on them successfully achieving this ISO certification.
The stakes are incredibly high.
And on the afternoon of the final day, the auditor is reviewing the supplier evaluation records. They discover that the facility has been purchasing critical safety components from an unapproved supplier who has no quality controls in place, and they have been falsifying the receiving inspection logs to cover it up.
It is a massive systemic failure, a textbook major nonconformity.
The auditor now has to walk into the closing meeting, sit across from the CEO, the quality director, and the production managers, and tell them that they have failed the audit. They have to tell them that their certification will be delayed, which means they will likely lose the government contract, potentially costing the company tens of millions of dollars and leading to layoffs.
The tension in that room is suffocating. The executives might get angry. They might yell. They might threaten to call the certification body's global headquarters and demand a new auditor.
They might beg for leniency, asking the auditor to just write it up as a minor issue that they promised to fix tomorrow.
That moment right there is why Annex D requires moral courage. It is the visceral, intensely uncomfortable reality of standing your ground in a room full of powerful, angry people and holding the line for the integrity of the standard.
The auditor must look the CEO in the eye and say, I understand the implications, but the objective evidence shows a systemic failure. I cannot recommend certification. If auditors lack that specific psychological trait, the entire global architecture of trust collapses.
It perfectly illustrates why the final certification decision is handled the way it is. Let's look at Clause 7.5, outsourcing. A certification body might be overwhelmed with work, so they can outsource parts of the process. They can hire independent contractor auditors to conduct the physical audits.
But the standard strictly dictates what cannot be outsourced. A certification body can never outsource the decisions for granting, refusing, maintaining, or withdrawing certification.
The buck stops with the entity whose name is on the certificate. They can borrow the expertise to gather the evidence, but they cannot offshore their legal and ethical accountability.
Which brings us to Section 5, the paper trail and public image. This covers Clause 8, information requirements. Once that morally courageous auditor files their report and the certification body makes the decision to grant the certificate, how is that communicated to the world?
Clause 8.1 and 8.2 govern public information and the physical certification documents. The cert body has to provide, upon request, information about the validity of a given certification, and the certificate itself must be completely unambiguous.
It must include the name and geographical location of the client, the effective and expiry dates, a unique identification code, the specific management system standard like ISO 12001.2015, and the exact scope of certification.
The scope is critical. A massive conglomerate might only certify one specific division or one specific factory. The certificate must clearly state manufacturer of electronic components at the Austin, Texas facility. It prevents the conglomerate from claiming their entire global operation is certified based on one site.
But the most important consumer-facing regulation in this entire standard is found in Clause 8.3, the strict rules on marks and logos. This addresses a massive, industry-wide misconception.
How many times have you walked through a hardware store, pick up a power tool or a piece of safety equipment and seen a giant ISO 9001 certified logo stamped right on the cardboard box?
Right, the average consumer looks at that and thinks, this specific drill has been tested and certified by ISO to be high quality.
And that is entirely false. ISO 9001 certifies the management system of the company that produced the drill. It does not certify the drill itself. A company could have a perfectly certified quality management system that efficiently and consistently produces terrible products as long as they are following their own documented procedures for doing so.
Therefore, the standard is ruthlessly strict about this to prevent misleading the public. Clause 8.3 explicitly states that a management system certification mark can never be used on a product or product packaging in a way that implies the product itself is certified.
And industry professionals know how companies will try to exploit loopholes. A company might say, well, the logo is on the outer shipping box, not the product itself, so it's fine.
To combat this, 17021 provides a hard definition of what constitutes packaging. It defines product packaging as that which can be removed without the product disintegrating or being damaged.
So the cardboard box holding the drill is packaging. The plastic blister pack holding a pair of headphones is packaging. You cannot put an ambiguous ISO certification mark on them.
The standard goes further. What about permanent fixtures? It states that type labels or identification plates are considered part of the product. So an industrial machinery manufacturer absolutely cannot engrave or stamp an ISO certification logo onto the metal identification plate riveted to the side of a lathe.
So what can a company do? Because they obviously want to market their achievement.
The standard allows them to use a statement on product packaging or accompanying information, but the statement must be highly specific. It must include the name of the certified client, the type of management system and the applicable standard, and the certification body issuing the certificate.
For example, manufactured by XYZ Corp., whose quality management system is certified to ISO 9001 by ABC certification body. It removes the ambiguity. It clearly states the system is certified, not the product.
And if a client violates this, if they start slapping the certification body's logo directly onto their products, the certification body is legally obligated to take action. This is part of the contract. The action could range from demanding corrective actions to suspending the certificate or even initiating legal action for trademark infringement.
Protecting the mark is protecting the trust in the entire system. Another critical aspect of maintaining that trust is found in Clause 8.5. Notice of changes. A certificate is valid for 3 years. But businesses are not static entities.
A client is legally bound to inform the certification body without delay of any matters that may affect the capability of the management system to continue fulfilling the requirements. This includes changes in legal or commercial status, like a merger or an acquisition. It includes changes in key managerial staff. It includes modifications to the product or the processes.
If a certified manufacturing plant is bought by a private equity firm, and the new owners immediately fire the entire quality department and change all the suppliers to cut costs, the certification body needs to know that immediately. They can't wait 2 years for the next scheduled audit.
In those instances, the certification body has to evaluate the changes and decide if they need to conduct a special short-notice audit to verify that the management system hasn't collapsed under the new structure.
All of this brings us to the operational heart of the document. Section 6, Process Requirements. Clause 9. This is the most extensive part of 17021-1, detailing the strict, step-by-step mechanics of how an audit is actually executed from start to finish. It begins with Clause 9.1. Pre-certification activities.
Before an auditor ever steps foot on a site, the certification body must review the client's application. They need to gather detailed information about the scope of the desired certification, the size of the organization, the number of employees, the complexity of their operations, and any specific regulatory requirements.
And all of this data is used for one critical calculation, determining the audit time. We discussed the definition earlier, but here is where the strict rules apply. The standard requires the cert body to have documented procedures for determining audit time, and they must be based on a framework that prevents arbitrary discounting.
They look at the base requirements for a company of a certain size. Then they apply adjustment factors. Is the operation highly complex, like an oil refinery? Increase the time. Is it a low-risk, simple assembly operation? Maybe decrease the time slightly. Does the client have multiple identical sites? There are sampling rules for that.
But the standard identifies specific friction points that cert bodies might use to manipulate the time. For example, travel time. If a mining corporation needs an audit at a remote extraction site in northern Canada, it might take the auditor 2 full days just to travel there from the airport.
Clause 9.1.4 explicitly states that time spent traveling to and from the site, or time spent by translators, or time spent by observers and auditors in training, does not count toward the official audit duration.
The cert body cannot tell the client, "We are billing you for a 5-day audit," if the auditor spends 2 days traveling, 1 day getting translated, and only 2 days actually assessing evidence. The calculated audit time must reflect pure, unadulterated evaluation effort.
Once the time is locked in, Clause 9.2 covers planning the audit and selecting the team. The cert body must ensure the team, collectively, has all the required sector-specific competence we discussed in Annex A. But it also dictates the rules of engagement for non-auditors who are present.
During an audit, you almost always have guides. These are personnel appointed by the client to facilitate the audit. They show the auditor where the departments are, they introduce them to the managers, and they ensure the auditor follows site safety rules.
But the standard strictly regulates their behavior. It explicitly states that guides must not influence or interfere with the audit process or the outcome.
This is a common operational issue. A guide might try to steer an auditor away from a department they know is struggling. "Oh, you don't want to go down to shipping today. It's really loud and messy. Let's go look at the new HR training room instead."
Or, when an auditor asks a machine operator a question, the guide jumps in and answers for them to ensure the correct answer is given. The standard gives the auditor the authority to shut that down, and if the guide persists, it can be grounds for terminating the audit.
Assuming the planning goes smoothly, we reach the main event. Clause 9.3, the initial certification audit. And a crucial concept for industry professionals is that this is never a single event. It is a mandated 2-stage process.
Stage 1 and Stage 2. You cannot simply show up on day 1 and start handing out a certificate. Stage 1 is essentially the readiness review. It can sometimes be done remotely, depending on the risks.
The primary objective of Stage 1 is to review the client's documented management system information. The auditor's looking at the blueprint. They evaluate the client's specific site conditions and engage with personnel to determine if the organization is actually prepared for Stage 2.
They are asking fundamental questions. Are internal audits being planned and performed? Have management reviews taken place? Do they understand their own environmental aspects or quality objectives? The auditor is trying to determine if the level of implementation substantiates that the client is ready for the deep evaluation.
This creates a lot of friction between Stage 1 and Stage 2. A client might have hired a consultant to write a beautiful, pristine, 500-page quality manual. The documentation looks perfect. But during Stage 1, the auditor realizes that none of the managers have actually read it, and the internal audit was just a single paragraph saying everything is fine.
In that scenario, the standard requires the certification body to communicate the areas of concern. The results of Stage 1 can, and often do, lead to the postponement or outright cancellation of Stage 2.
It acts as a gatekeeper. It saves everyone time, money, and massive frustration. There is no point in sending a team of 3 auditors to a site for a week for Stage 2 if the system only exists on paper. But assuming they resolve the concerns and pass Stage 1, they advance.
Stage 2 is the deep evaluation. It always takes place at the site or sites of the client. The purpose is to evaluate the actual implementation, including effectiveness, of the management system. This is the boots on the ground, show me the evidence phase.
They are checking performance monitoring, operational control, and management responsibility. Clause 9.4 governs how this audit is conducted. It requires a formal opening meeting to confirm the audit plan, the scope, and the safety procedures. It sets the professional tone.
Then the communication and data gathering begins. Auditors obtain and verify information through interviews, observation of processes, and review of documents and records. They are triangulating reality. If the procedure says X, the manager says X, but the operator on the floor is doing Y, there is a breakdown.
When a breakdown is found, it leads to one of the most fascinating and psychologically difficult rules in the entire standard. Clause 9.4.5.3, what I call the no advice rule.
When an auditor identifies a nonconformity, they must record it against a specific requirement and detail the objective evidence clearly. The client must understand exactly what failed and why, but the text adds a critical sentence. The auditor, however, shall refrain from suggesting the cause of nonconformities or their solution.
Let's really analyze the friction here. You have an auditor who is an absolute industry expert. They've seen 100 different manufacturing plants. They see a client struggling with a defective process control on a CNC machine. The client looks at the auditor, completely exasperated, and asks, okay, we agree it's failing. How do we fix it? What do other companies do?
It is human nature to want to help. The auditor knows exactly how to fix it. They know a simple software patch or a specific sensor would solve the issue instantly, but the moment they give that advice, they violate 17021.1.
Why? Why is the standard so rigid about preventing an expert from helping a struggling client?
Because it circles all the way back to the impartiality principles and the self-review threat. The moment the auditor tells the client how to fix the problem, the auditor has become an unpaid consultant. Let's play out the scenario. The auditor says, install this specific optical sensor. The client spends $10,000 installing the sensor. Next year, the auditor returns for a surveillance audit. They discover the sensor doesn't work in this specific environment, and the machine is still producing defective parts.
Is the auditor going to write a major nonconformity against the client for following their own advice?
Exactly. The auditor's objectivity is completely compromised. They are now emotionally and professionally invested in the solution. They might ignore the defect to avoid looking incompetent. To maintain absolute independence, the auditor can point out that the house is on fire, but they cannot hand the client the fire extinguisher or tell them how to build a fireproof house. The burden of root cause analysis and corrective action must rest entirely on the client.
It maintains the firewall. After the audit concludes, there is a formal closing meeting where all findings are presented. The client then has a set time frame to analyze the root causes of their nonconformities and submit a plan for corrective actions. The certification body reviews this plan to ensure it's robust.
And then we reach Clause 9.5, the certification decision. The audit team has finished their work. They have reviewed the corrective actions. They write a recommendation, grant certification, or deny it. But the audit team does not make the final decision.
Another massive structural firewall. Clause 9.5.1 mandates the separation of powers. The person or the committee making the decision for granting certification must be different from those who carried out the audit.
The individuals making the decision must have the competence to evaluate the audit report, but they cannot have been subjected to the familiarity or intimidation threats present during the on-site audit. They are a cold, objective, fresh set of eyes. They look at the evidence presented in the report. Does the evidence justify the recommendation? If the auditor missed a crucial step, or if the client's corrective action plan is actually insufficient, this independent decision maker will catch it and push back.
So the independent committee reviews it, agrees with the recommendation, and the client receives his certificate. The champagne is popped. But as industry professionals know, the work doesn't stop. Clause 9.6 governs maintaining certification.
A certificate is valid for 3 years, but the standard does not allow a client to simply put the plaque on the wall and ignore their system for 36 months. It mandates surveillance activities. Surveillance audits must be conducted at least once a calendar year.
These aren't full system audits like Stage 2.
No, they are targeted. They must cover internal audits, management reviews, actions taken on previous nonconformities, and the handling of customer complaints. They evaluate a sample of the operations to ensure the system is still breathing and functioning between the major recertification cycles.
And recertification must be completed before the current certificate expires. The standard is unforgiving here. If a client has a major nonconformity during the recertification audit and they fail to implement effective corrective actions before the expiry date on their certificate, the certification body cannot simply extend the validity of the old certificate while they figure it out. The certificate expires. They lose their status.
Clause 9.6.4 also details rules for special audits, specifically short notice or unannounced audits. We touched on this regarding notice of changes, but it also applies to investigating complaints or following up on suspended clients.
And the standard adds a fascinating logistical constraint here. Normally, a client is given the names of the audit team in advance, and they have the right to object to a specific auditor, perhaps due to a conflict of interest, like the auditor used to work for a competitor.
But during a short notice audit, the client doesn't have that luxury of time. Therefore, the standard places a heavier burden on the certification body to exercise extreme care in assigning the audit team. They must ensure absolute impartiality because the client cannot act as an effective filter.
Rounding out the process requirements, we have clauses 9.7 and 9.8, appeals and complaints. This is the due process of the certification world.
If a client vehemently disagrees with a major nonconformity raised by an auditor, they have the right to appeal. If a major consumer advocacy group claims a certified environmental management system is actively polluting a river, they have the right to complain. The certification body must have a documented, rigorous process to handle these.
And the key structural requirement here is independence. The individuals assigned to investigate the appeal or the complaint cannot have been involved in the subject of the dispute. You can't have the auditor who wrote the nonconformity be the one investigating the appeal against it. And the cert body must ensure that submitting an appeal or a complaint doesn't result in any discriminatory action against the submitter. This brings us to the final section of our journey, Section 7, covering Clause 10. We have spent this entire deep dive looking at the incredibly strict, rigorous rules that a certification body must force its clients to endure. The constant internal auditing, the management reviews, the document control, the corrective actions. It begs the ultimate question: who audits the auditors? Practicing what you preach, Clause 10 mandates that the certification body must establish, document, implement, and maintain its own management system. They must prove they are capable of achieving the requirements of ISO 17021- consistently. It completely eliminates any hypocrisy from the industry.
The standard provides two options for this. Option A is the general approach. The cert body establishes a customized management system manual. They implement strict document control and record control, mandating they keep records for the current certification cycle plus one full prior cycle. They must conduct their own internal audits, identifying their own systemic failures, and establishing corrective actions. They must hold executive management reviews at least yearly.
They are forced to drink their own champagne. They have to experience the exact same administrative and operational rigor they demand from the manufacturing plants and tech companies they audit.
Or they can choose option B. This option allows the certification body to simply implement and maintain their management system in accordance with ISO 9001. Since ISO 9001 is the global gold standard for quality management, a cert body can integrate the specific rules of 17021-1 into an ISO 9001 framework.
It proves that the engine of continuous improvement, the plan, do, check, act cycle, applies to the inspector just as much as the inspected. The rules of gravity apply to everyone.
And that concludes our journey through the sequence of the standard. We have moved from the initial definitions of impartiality and consultancy through the philosophical pillars and psychological threats. We've examined the structural firewalls of the two-year rule and the committee watchdogs. We've profiled the morally courageous auditor. We've clarified the absolute boundaries of certification marks on product packaging. And we've walked through the grueling logistics of the two-stage process, the no advice rule, and the separation of powers for the final decision.
It is an incredibly dense, beautifully paranoid piece of architecture. The next time you walk into a supplier's facility and see an ISO management certification hanging on the lobby wall, you won't just see a piece of paper. You will understand the massive, heavily regulated, deeply human machinery that was required to generate that single document. You will know the intense scrutiny, the mitigated conflicts of interest, and the rigid protocols that sit behind the logo.
It is the unseen infrastructure that allows global supply chains to function with confidence.
And that leaves us with a provocative final concept for you to ponder. We've spent this entire time unpacking how ISO 14021-1 forces a certification body to ensure a client's compliance. We've explored the rules that govern the certifiers. But if certification body is governed by this document, who checks the certification body to ensure they are actually following it?
There are accreditation bodies, national entities like ANA in the US or UK's in the UK, that audit the certification bodies. And above them, there's the International Accreditation Forum that peer reviews the accreditation bodies.
It is an infinite regress of trust, layers upon layers of oversight. But I want you to think about the reality at the very top of that pyramid. Ultimately, at the absolute apex of the global economic chain, all the standards, all the documented procedures, and all the structural firewalls eventually run out. At the very top, the system cannot rely on another piece of paper. It has to rest entirely on human integrity. It relies completely on the exact behavioral trait we analyzed in Annex D, moral courage. The entire global system of commercial trust functions only because, somewhere in that chain, an individual is brave enough to look at a massive, powerful entity and say, no, the objective evidence does not support this, you do not pass. The rules only work because people have the courage to enforce them. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.